Hi, I'm Stefan Redpath, and today I'll be critiquing a paper titled Chronic Video Game Exposure and Desensitization to Violence. Prior research had shown that repeated exposure to media violence could decrease an individual's aversion to violent imagery. These aversion reactions are part of normal human behavior. Researchers hypothesized that desensitization could have a cognitive link to an increase in aggressive behavioral patterns. They proposed to investigate this link between increased aggressive behavior and desensitization to violent imagery. Researchers had two primary aims in this study. The first was to measure whether there is a link between violent video game exposure and decreased aversion to violent imagery. The second was to investigate whether the measured decrease in aversion to violent imagery would translate into increased aggressive behavior. Researchers had two hypotheses for this study. The first was if a participant had more frequent and prolonged exposure to violent video games, they would show lower aversion to violent images. The second was if a participant had lower aversion to violent imagery, they would be more likely to engage in aggressive behaviors. The study included 39 participants. They were all undergraduate students from the USA. They were all male, right-handed, and had normal vision. The mean age was 19.5 years old. Researchers chose a between-group study design for comparing exposure and proclivity towards aggression. The independent variable in this design was exposure to violent video games. This was determined through self-reporting. There were two dependent variables in this study. Dependent variable 1 was aversion to violent imagery. This was measured by recording the electrophysiological response to violent negative, non-violent negative, and neutral images. The second dependent variable was proclivity towards aggressive behavior. Participants were told they were competing in a reaction speed game against another human competitor in an adjacent room. If their reaction speed was faster than the other participant, the winner could deliver a blast of sound in their earphones as punishment. The winner could choose the intensity and duration of the punishment blast. This was taken as a measure of aggression. Researchers had two main findings. The P300 aversion reactions for violent images were lower for participants with a higher exposure to violent video games. Chart A shows the P300 readings for violent negative images. There was a clear decreased aversion in participants who were frequently exposed to violent video games. Chart B, on the other hand, shows the P300 readings for non-violent negative images. As you can see, there was no difference for non-violent negative images between the groups. The effect of desensitization seems to only apply to images of violent nature. The second finding was that the intensity and duration of the blast given was higher for those with longer exposure to violent video games. This was taken as a measure of aggression. Researchers concluded that there is a specific desensitization to violent imagery with prolonged exposure to violent video games. They also concluded that this desensitization effect increases the likelihood of aggressive behavior patterns. These findings may have many potential implications. For clinical psychologists and counselors, patients being treated for antisocial personality disorders should avoid stimulus that might increase their likelihood of exhibiting aggressive behaviors. The findings could also have implications for classification boards. With greater knowledge of the potential public harm these media forms could contribute to, classification boards may have justification for more stringent guidelines for younger gamers. These findings could also have implications for parents and the public in general. Parents and the general public should be better informed about the kinds of violent exposure that may increase the risk of aggressive behavior. There were some limitations to this study. Participants self-reported their exposure to violent video games. It's highly possible that participants could over-report or under-report their exposure time. They were also required to self-rate the levels of violence in the video games. Researchers could have used more objective methods to collect this data. A third limitation is that the participants couldn't see the person who they were theoretically punishing. They were told that there was another human in an adjacent room, but they never had an interaction with this person. To them, they were simply turning knobs and pushing buttons. In this way, this simulation is more like a video game. Researchers could have just been measuring how violent gamers react to aggressive video game simulations. To measure true proclivity towards aggression, the participants should see the human effects of their aggressive behavior. Lastly, the study design failed to completely rule out other hypotheses. There are many third variables that could partially account for an individual's propensity towards aggression. Perhaps a low aversion to violent imagery correlates with aggression for underlying genetic reasons. And perhaps people with a lower aversion to violent imagery are more drawn towards violent media forms. While the researchers did make some effort to rule out rival hypotheses, these were not completely ruled out in this design. Thank you very much for your time.